and I'm not likening for a moment bankers with pop stars or golfers or top tennis players, all of whom earn tens of millions of dollars a year. And you might make the same argument that that's not particularly fair. Good morning there, Delia, in London. This is your father speaking. I'm in Melbourne, and my name is Tony Burgess, and this is my second round interview with you, following the first. So, which I guess might be a good sign if there's a demand for a follow up. So, Delia, I'm in your hands.
Okay. Well, do you want to recap what we talked about on the first one?
Well, it's probably better. You're the host. It's probably better that you do a recap.
Well, I guess the conversation came about because I was asking about your career and what motivated you to work in corporate finance, and the question was actually whether you'd ever been motivated by money. Are you reading emails or what are you doing?
I'm concentrating.
So that was the question, and then you took us through your childhood and then how you ended up interested in economics, and then you were invited by the dean to do an internship in a stockbroking firm. And then from there ended up going to, them kind of sending you to Harvard and then working in New York and London and then coming back. And that's kind of as far as we got up to. But it was then misinterpreted. Your story was misinterpreted by another guest on this podcast who was pointing out the difference between what you've been motivated by and what I'm motivated by. And he was essentially saying that you're motivated by working hard, which would be right. Is that right? Or well, you can tell us. But he was concluding that you're motivated by earning money. I think there's a difference here because you interpreted that as like money, meaning just accumulating money for the sake of it. Whereas I think it was more about financial independence, like being responsible for yourself and not dependent on the state or anyone else. Which then goes back,
or parents.
Which then goes back into principles. And then I remember that you said at the end of last podcast that that's how you would describe yourself, principled. So then I thought you could come on and explain what these principles are that you live by.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's a fair summary, Delia, and I think a fair question. And I think it's accurate to say that I do have a strong work ethic, and that's just the way I guess I was born with it, or if I wasn't born with it, it was certainly inculcated into me by my mother and probably by my father's example. I mean, he worked in a factory, but he worked very hard and worked a lot of overtime to make sure that our family with 6 children in it were able to survive. So I don't know that I'm motivated by a strong work ethic. The strong work ethic provides the drive, I guess, to get on and get things done. but in terms of principles, if we come to that question, what are the principles by which I live my life? I think I would put them into three categories. First principle is trust and honesty, and I think it's very important to be, and they go hand in hand. And I think it's very important to be trustworthy in all of our relationships with other human beings, within the family and at work and in all other endeavours, because everything we do, I mean, as we know, it's a truism, human beings are societal creatures, and we're always involved in transactions of one sort or another with other people. And if you want to be, I think the best way of being effective on a long-term basis is to be honest and trustworthy, because every relationship involves repeated interactions, and you've got to have trust, and that's whether it's in a family situation or in a business situation. And I think there's an old saying about trust. I think it's earning trust is like going up the stairs, and you can lose if you make a mistake. You can lose trust like going down an elevator. I think that's a good analogy.
So, have you dealt with many dishonest people in your life?
Yes, I have. I've come across a lot of people who are dishonest or untrustworthy, and it probably means that if you have a choice, you don't deal with them at all, or if you do deal with them, you are ultra careful, and you don't take them at their word, because if they've demonstrated to you previously that they can't keep their word, or intentionally do not keep their word, you can't trust them. So it means that it's very difficult to have a relationship with them, or engage in in transactions with them. So yes. So do you want me to finish the principles? I've got three. I've summarised them into. Or do you want to inquire more about trustworthiness?
Well, I don't know. You can either say the three and then we can talk about them one at a time, or we can talk about them and then move on. But I have more questions.
Okay. Well, why don't I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't I just enunciate all three principles, and you can come back and ask questions. So the second principle I would broadly describe as having a sense of responsibility, and that means doing. You could also call that doing the right thing. So it really means that you've got to have you've got to be, I guess it goes to having a bit of courage to, when you see things that are wrong, to speak up about them. When you see things being done that are wrong, it means trying to intervene to prevent that occurring. So I think that's, and you can there are probably many other examples, but essentially having a sense of responsibility, which really is based on knowing right from wrong and acting on it. But it also means acting. It means that you can't sort of idly stand by while bad things or the wrong the wrong thing is happening. So that I would say that would be the second principle. And the third principle I would generally describe as being willing to step up and make a contribution, and that means in business, that means stepping forward and taking on responsibility for getting things that are needed to be done, getting them done. And in broader society, it means stepping up to make a contribution, whether it's a sporting club, where you volunteer as a parent to be the boundary umpire or the scorekeeper or something of that nature, or in the not-for-profit sector, getting involved in helping organisations. And I'm not just talking about making financial donations. I'm talking about sort of donating time and expertise. And the same applies to educational institutions. So that'd be the third principle, I would say, I'd summarise it as making a contribution. So I think they're the three principles that I would suggest that I have tried to abide by as I have lived my life.
And why do you think it's important to make a contribution?
Well, I think that we live in we don't live as an island. We live in a community. Well, I think there's two things, aren't there? One, in terms of work, or if you're in an employment, a traditional employment situation, working in a business, it's always important it's always important to show leadership. I mean, that benefits everyone. So I think it's important in a business situation, and equally in any community situation. Only if people, society is a better place if people step forward and actually contribute to make things operate. Whether it's sort of running a junior football club or running a major philanthropic foundation, it requires people to actually put their hand up and step forward and contribute. And society is the better for that. I mean, if we all were narrowly, I would call it enlightened self-interest. If we're all narrowly focused on our own endeavours and interests, and didn't contribute more broadly, we would be the society in which we live would be much worse off, and that would affect all of us. So I think that's why I think it is important to make a contribution, and not be selfish about it.
And have you done that all throughout your career, even in times when you were busy working?
And I'm not hearing you now, Delia.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Have you done that consistently throughout your career, or how are you doing that now?
How am I doing it now? The latter thing. Well, look, I'm on a. I've got quite a few not-for-profit involvements, including I'm a governor of the Ian Potter Foundation, which is one of Australia's largest philanthropic foundations. I'm the chair of the finance committee there. I'm on the board of Melbourne Business School. I'm chair of the Foundation for Business and Economics at University of Melbourne. I'm on the board of Melbourne Theatre Company. These are all pro bono roles, if you like, and they're all for organisations that have a make a strong contribution to the community. So yes, and look, I've probably taken on as my I've taken on more sort of we call them outside interests or not for profit involvements probably in the last 10 to 12 years, and that's really as my available time available to devote to those activities has increased, and that's largely coincided with you and your brothers finishing school. So I've got more time has been freed up accordingly.
How were you able to contribute when you were working in London?
Not as well. That was only for not as effectively, because the two factors. One, your children were still at school, so there was a lot more of, I guess, your mother and my time engaged in school-related activities, and that all involving all four of you. A and B, probably we weren't there long enough to establish deep community roots like those we have in Melbourne.
But
and C, I was probably a hell of a lot busier professionally.
Yeah, but don't you think part of that would be a cultural thing, that like how many... Because, yeah, didn't you do stuff like, goal umpire or whatever, even when you were working very busy hours in Melbourne? Whereas in New York or London, maybe this is wrong, but culturally, like, I can't imagine that many Wall Street bankers are then, maybe that's wrong, but helping out with their kids' stuff, like working insane hours and then somehow doing some community thing as well.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm sure that many people in investment banking with families do contribute a lot of time to participating in their children's sporting and other activities.
Do you remember that from when you worked there or no?
In London,
or in New York?
well, I'm sure that was I think. Yeah, well, I know from colleagues that they did in both cities. They did participate actively in their children's sporting endeavours, for example, and beyond sporting. So yes, so I think the suggestion that just because and that would apply to any professionals, whether they were lawyers, accountants, or actuaries or otherwise, all of whom management consultants, all of whom work hard, but all of whom make a real contribution to their real family contribution to their children's various activities. I don't think you can assume that because they work hard, they don't contribute in other spheres.
Well, I guess I'm more asking that there's this idea, and people could even say that about boards. People could be just say, oh, that's purely for self-interest and for having those roles just to have more status, and it's nothing to do with actually caring. Like, a lot of people listening to that might have that view, and a lot of people even amongst I told you this when I had dinner with your cycling friends in Milan, and someone made a comment about how greedy bankers are. Like, this is the sentiment amongst the general population, that bankers are greedy and bad, evil people who are I don't know, who are the reason everything's so... I mean, you see this all the time on social media and whatever. It's like it's all anyone who works in finance there to blame for all the issues in the world.
Yeah. Oh well, I think a lot of people good at sort of blaming others for all sorts of ills. So I think if there was a question there, it was, don't you join not-for-profit boards purely for status? If that's the question, I think. I heard
some people probably would do that. I mean, do you find people who are in these roles for the wrong reasons?
Look, I think that's the same. You could say that there's always a proportion of people who will tend to do things more for status than for purpose, the purpose of making a contribution, and that's in every field of endeavour. And they're normally, and you can normally figure out who those people are, because they don't roll their sleeves up and do the work, do any work, or do the work that's required to sort of help make a contribution to the relevant not-for-profit, if we're sticking with that example. But in terms of I should also answer your question about the sentiment, or the view that bankers are greedy, are all without exception greedy, uncaring individuals, and that's a gross generalisation. And are there greedy bankers? There, no doubt. But I don't know that the proportion of bankers who are greedy is any greater than the proportion of lawyers who are greedy, or real estate agents who are all greedy, and we could go on and on through the various
all those people wear
occupations.
Suits, so the generalization might be extended to anyone wearing a suit. So I think if you've got to use a teacher or a nurse as a merchant,
a shopkeeper, a doctor. So there are I think there are, sadly there are extremes of greed and sort of pure selfishness everywhere across the community. It's hard to think of occupations or walks of life where there is a lower proportion of that. Maybe you have to look at people who have real vocations. So maybe you wouldn't put teachers in that category, perhaps, if they've got a real vocation, and maybe you wouldn't put people of the cloth into that category.
What does people of the cloth mean?
Priests, vicars, So, because they tend to be the calling that they probably have a calling that involves a much more caring nature. But outside of those particular, I'm going to call them vocational occupations, I think it's hard to say there is a materially different level of proportion of greed in any particular profession.
Historically, though, with the clergy, that probably there was a lot about greed, wasn't there? Because that's where a lot of wealth was. As in,
Yes, no doubt. Well, and it was a way of advancement for you know, they didn't. There weren't too many other professions in those days, so becoming a cleric was, was a way of advancing oneself, and certainly the way of advancing oneself financially and from a power, from a from a the from the viewpoint of exercising power or accumulating power, but that's probably no longer less of the case these days.
Well, then sadly, there's just been having power over vulnerable people in society, but that's a whole nother point. So what would you say to someone who says bankers shouldn't, it's disgusting how much they earn, and that you shouldn't have earned whatever bonuses you were given, that's wrong?
Well, what you would say that's just the way the market works. I mean, people, you might not like how much value is attributed to the services of investment bankers or corporate financiers, but that's what the market has determined, and so it's in the same way as various, and I'm not likening for a moment bankers with pop stars or golfers or top golfers or top tennis players, all of whom earn tens of millions of dollars a year, and you might make the same argument that that's not particularly fair, but it's just there is actually a market for those for those roles, let's call it, and they're the outcomes that the market determines. So that is a function of the free enterprise, certainly in the Western world, the free enterprise system in which we operate. And you might say it is unfair that tennis professionals or golfing professionals earn millions and millions of dollars, whereas school teachers, who you could well argue have far greater responsibilities to our community, particularly in terms of educating our young, and they get paid a small fraction of that, and actually get relatively poorly paid compared to other professional activities. But again, that's just a function of it's a function of the marketplace.
And I think it would be helpful if you could explain what your job actually entails, because, I mean, at least I found when I was working at an investment bank, even people within the bank didn't seem to understand what the role is of and then certainly people outside finance invest. When I hear the word investment, they think it's to do with personal investing. They don't seem to understand I guess the average person thinks of banks as in retail banks, and they aren't necessarily aware of what corporate finance is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I think corporate we can summarise corporate finance into sort of two main activities. One is advising, which is sort of advising governments, businesses, wealthy individuals on buying and selling businesses, and that's M&A advisory, and it involves either acting for the vendor or the seller or the buyer. So in that way, the corporate financier is somewhat like an agent, providing advice to their principal as to the best way of either selling an asset or a business, or buying that asset or business. But that's essentially the role. It's advisory, and the other main activity within corporate finances is raising, or traditional corporate finance traditionally defined as raising finance for companies, and that's either equity finance or debt finance, and that involves usually underwriting the issues of equity or debt. One area, investment banking, if we use that broader term, also will include the activity of trading securities, buying and selling securities, debt, equity, derivatives, on the various markets, and within that probably some proprietary trading as well. But the corporate finance is really advisory and what we used to call new issue work, and it's a wholesale activity, if you like. Involves dealing with businesses, governments, large corporations, rather than sort of the man on the street. So it's a wholesale activity rather than a retail activity. Does that help, Delia? Does that
I think
explain
people probably think of that. I guess that's from films and whatever. People probably think of the third category first, that it's like Wolf of Wall Street or something, buying and selling, trading, being on the phone. But that's not what we're talking about. Do you?
Well, not in
in terms of your career.
Correct. I've always been in the traditional corporate finance area of advising companies on buying and selling businesses and assets, and also underwriting, leading the underwriting of new issues of equities, including IPOs and debt issues.
Yeah, which people probably have no idea what any of that means. But just to go to the first example, can you use a deal you've done to illustrate what that actually involves, and then where the fees come from as well?
Okay. Well,
and M&A means mergers and acquisitions. That's also
M&A means
common.
M&A means mergers and acquisitions. So just in terms of something we've advised on recently, and this transaction hasn't completed yet, but we have, and this will mean something to those in Australia who listen to this, but perhaps not to any of your overseas listeners. So we advised ANZ Bank, which is one of Australia's largest four banks, to acquire a regional bank based in Queensland called Suncorp Bank, and that was for a transaction value of 4.9 billion Australian dollars. It was announced in July, and it's subject to regulatory approval, and will hopefully, all going well, complete sometime next year. But that's a situation where we advised the ANZ Bank on buying that property, shall we call it, Suncorp Bank, and in terms of both from a valuation point of view, but also in terms of the undertaking the due diligence and then documenting the transaction, negotiating the transaction documentation, and also also some contribution to the thinking as to how best to fund the acquisition. So that's a typical corporate finance advisory assignment.
And the fee works?
Well, we get paid in that case, we get paid by ANZ Bank for our services.
Based on the deal closing?
Yeah.
And so it's a percentage of the deal value? It wasn't. I'm just trying to illustrate how because people, I think when people think bank, this is evil and whatever, they imagine bankers are literally taking money out of other people's pockets and taking advantage of their financial illiteracy and trying to sell them products or something. But I'm trying to illustrate that this is to do with corporations, and it's based on a transaction, and the value that's captured comes out of this big transaction, and that's kind of why there's so much. Well, first, it explains a lot of things. It explains why it's so intense, working so hard around these transactions, weekends, long hours, late into the night, and because, these big fees are the kind of reward for that work, and that's what attracts a lot of people to go into it.
Yeah. We get paid a transaction fee, which is payable if the transaction closes, and it's a small percentage of the amount paid. But yes, in that case, our client, ANZ Bank, has willingly agreed to pay us a fee, so representing, the value we've contributed to making the transaction happen.
Yeah. And then, of course, bonuses are all linked to, how many deals are done and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, well,
as well
you can only... most large investment banks and corporate independent corporate finance advisory firms, they will pay their employees bonuses, and the bonuses will depend upon the level of profitability of the firm, which in turn depends upon the revenue the firm generates, which in turn will depend on transaction activity. So, and that will vary from year to year. So it's quite so there is, it's not an annuity type business in that sense. I mean, the financial performance of every investment bank will vary from year to year, and the bonuses that get paid to employees will depend upon not only the financial performance of the firm as a whole, but also their individual contribution. So there's a lot of variability in bonuses.
And what would you say on this point about contributing? It's just thinking of a lot of people in my generation who would say, of course, someone from your generation can talk about this because you had it so easy and you could buy houses, and now the world's so messed up and we will never be able to afford to buy houses and all X, Y, and Z problems, and we have it worse off. Which I think that is what the data shows, that this generation is the first that won't be wealthier than the previous. But what do you think about that?
Well, we don't know I think the jury's out on whether whether the I don't know which generation you're up to, but if you're comparing to the baby boomers, perhaps will this generation, your generation, are you a millennial or are you Gen X?
Don't know, to be honest.
Okay.
X, maybe.
Okay. Well, to take the point, there is no doubt that my generation have.
No, I'm not X. That's really old. I think I'm Y. Okay, sorry.
Okay, all right. Well, certainly I think I'm a baby boomer, and I think the baby boomer generation have had the benefit of incredible period of prosperity, and particularly starting from the early 1980s. 70s was a terrible decade in terms of high oil price shocks, high inflation, lots of unemployment. Since the early 80s, when Paul Volcker, then head of the chair of the Federal Reserve, beat inflation, we've had a period of punctuated by a couple of crises, as is normally the case, but we've had a 30-year period of broadly unprecedented economic prosperity, driven really by two things. Maybe we say three things. One, steadily declining interest rates over that period up until probably June of this year, and that has caused a massive inflation in real asset prices around the world, including real estate, and so that's one. Two,
Can you explain that mechanism?
Well,
because in layman's terms, because this, I think, is part of the problem, that people think there's this class of people who understand finance, who manipulate the system for their own gain, and then everyone else suffers, when actually it's just that there's a massive problem with financial illiteracy, and we all, the average person should understand these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the price of any financial asset is always a function of the prevailing benchmark interest rate. So when interest rates are high, if the price of financial assets is lower, and when interest rates are lower, the price of financial assets is higher. It's just simple arithmetic. So certainly the last 30 or 40 years, interest rates have declined enormously. That tide has turned. That's one. Two, we've had massive, again, in the past 40 years, and maybe we extend this to the post-World War II period, there has been a massive globalization. So you've had of trade. So you've had, this is Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage in action, and that has led to, global trade has grown at probably double the rate of global GDP growth, and that's really facilitated an increased standard of living around the world, but particularly to Western countries. I think sadly that trend is also as part of that, China entering the World Trade Organization in early 2000 accelerated that trend. Now that trend is also looks as though it's going to reverse, unfortunately, because of the following not only COVID but the fracturing of the geopolitical tensions between China and the West is probably going to lead to a reverse of globalization. And the third big trend, that's enabled an enormous increase in economic prosperity over the last 30 to 40 years has been automation in across a. This is a technology boom, and it's basically enabled a lot more to be done for less effectively, which has helped driven productivity and lower costs of lots of electronic things, and enable a lot of digitalization of products and marketing. They're the big three drivers, if you like, of increased prosperity that the baby boomers have enjoyed. Now, does it mean your generation will your generation experience the same benefits? Well, I think the third one will make the third big driver of I'm going to call it productivity, being technology. I think that's like to remain in place. But the first two, the second one, I think we're probably going to walk back from the globalization, or there'll be some undoing of globalization in supply chains and the like, and that does involve higher costs that will come as a result of that. So that does adversely impact standards of living. It's probably the first point which is not going to benefit your generation, Delia, because while the baby boomers we've benefited from interest rates coming from, let's call it, double-digit levels in the 80s to zero, and after the following the very low rates maintained by central banks following the global financial crisis and reinforced during COVID. Well, that trend is in the process of being reversed, and that is having an impact on the value of financial assets. That's why stock markets are falling at the moment, and why house prices are falling. Certainly in every Western country, house prices are falling at a decent clip. So maybe houses will become affordable again for your generation, Delia, as a result of that.
But what about wages keeping up with it? Because isn't there another, like, looking at, in London, for example, I think 30 years ago or something, it was something like the ratio of salary to the house value for a house in London, people were buying, it was like 3-1 or something like that, and now it's 10-1. So is that only explained by the house prices increasing, or is that also slow wage growth?
Well, I think it's mainly. Well, I think there are the biggest factors in in house price increases, certainly in Australia, I think you could probably apply this to the UK, have been falling interest rates, which means that for any level of income, you can, if your mortgage rate is lower, your monthly repayments, the same monthly repayment will service a much larger loan. And when mortgage rates, I mean, when your mother and I bought our first house, which I think was in maybe 1987, our mortgage rate was 16%. Okay, and up until recently in Australia, before the Reserve Bank started increasing interest rates, I think mortgage rates were just under 2%. So you can imagine, for the same level of income, you could service a much larger loan, and that has been the single largest factor in driving house prices up. The second one has been, and maybe this also applies in the UK, but certainly in Australia, the proportion of female participation in the workforce has increased dramatically over the past 30 to 40 years. So in other words, there are a lot more dual income couples, and that has meant more firepower to be able to service a loan, to service a mortgage, to buy a house. And that's been the other factor that's actually driven house prices up relative to income of an individual. I think you've then got other supply-demand factors. I mean, we've had, where there is immigration, positive inflows of people, and it's certainly been the case for Australia, UK, US. You've got greater demand for housing, and then there's also the question as to what happens on the supply side, and where there are restricted zoning laws, and probably that's the case in the UK. That will also be a factor in promoting house price growth. But it's the first two factors which are the dominant, the dominating factors. If that makes sense to you.
So then, all that in mind, what should a young person focus on?
Well, if I was being flippant, I would say they should be nice to their parents, because that means they can they might get left their parents' house when their parents pass on. Look, I think that's a flippant answer.
And they've got to have somewhere to live in the other 40 years.
Yes. Well, they might also want to be nice to their parents for that reason.
So people should live with their parents until their parents pass away, and then live in the house their parents bought.
You know what? Going
back, you don't
have to go back too many centuries to know that's actually used to be the norm, Delia. To be honest, but look, when you say what should young people do in terms of aspiring to home ownership, is that what you're asking?
Well, I don't know. I just mean in terms of saying life's unfair and everything sucks, and so then I'm gonna throw a can of soup on a Van Gogh painting or whatever happened the other day. I'm just gonna scream and cause destruction and blame everyone else, and I have no hope. Or, invest all my money in cryptocurrency and risk it, and then end up losing everything, and then it's like there's no faith in a system working for them. And I think there's also that whole envy that we touched on last time, like the obsession with wealth and people comparing and saying, even why do you need to own a home in a certain area? Or is there the idea, I guess it's this idea that this generation should do exactly what your generation did, or should be able to achieve all of that?
Yeah, well, I think that, as I've just explained, that my generation had the benefit of a, unprecedented period of prosperity for the reasons that I outlined. But I think and that might that same the same that same those same set of advantages may not accrue to the current generation, but one can't be sure of that. But in any event, it's a matter if people want to make sure that they are financially secure and otherwise have a fulfilling professional career. It just goes back to the fundamentals of making sure they've got a usable set of skills and find something that they are passionate about and which remunerates them reasonably well, and then apply themselves. I don't think the fundamentals have changed. They don't have to do anything differently, and I think you'll find that I wouldn't despair about people not being able to afford to buy a house or in the current generation, because I think the period of the housing price bubble that we've had over the past 5 to 10 years, I think is actually going to reverse, because it's all a function of interest rates, as I explained, and interest rates were held at abnormally low levels, unnaturally low levels, by central banks on what I think will be proven to have been a folly, but which in any event they're reversing very quickly. So, Delia, I don't know that there's despairing. I mean, I don't think it's just it's an outworking of markets that we're observing at the moment, and the fundamentals as to how one should sort of go about earning a living haven't changed.
What do you think about what happened in the UK, or what's happening now?
You mean politically?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, with the mini budget.
Oh, well, okay. Well, I think, and I'm not alone in this view, that the mini budget was a mistake. And again, we've talked about markets a little bit in this talk, but the financial markets are very powerful, and I think the mini budget that the Chancellor announced a couple of weeks ago now was deemed
former
Chancellor, he's been fired, was deemed by the markets to be fiscally irresponsible. I mean, effectively borrowing money to cut taxes, and was given the fiscal issues that the UK, like other Western economies, have at the moment, was seen by the markets to be was deemed by the markets to be irresponsible, and it's why the pound got hammered, and why UK gilts, UK bonds, Treasury bonds also got marked severely marked down. And I don't know that's. I know that he was, I guess, replaced on Friday. Jeremy Hunt seems to be a far more measured and sensible individual, but
does he know?
Sorry?
Whether he knows anything about economics. But I think, that's that's the problem. Basically, how could something like this happen? Because there's permanent damage from this, right? It's like pensions. A couple of my friends work in this, asset management pension world or insurance world. And it's like people lost a lot of money from this that isn't recoverable. So how does a mistake that bad happen? And a friend of mine was explaining that the economic advisors told them. So does it matter if politicians know nothing about economics? Maybe not if they're going to listen to their advisors. But if they're not, like, how can we have countries being run in this way where because presumably they didn't know they were going to cause this much damage. That wasn't their intention.
Certainly wasn't their intention. I think they've got very experienced and skilled economic advisors in Her Majesty's Treasury. Now, whether they were listened to or not is another matter. I don't know whether the damage is permanent, Delia. I mean, because
but people had margin calls, and then they had to, because the loss of the asset values dropped to the point that then there were margin calls, so then they had to sell assets.
Sure, okay.
Well,
that's probably permanent loss of value, but also it goes to the risks of having leverage against financial assets. In terms of how can alter.
But if that's your but you don't get to choose that. If that's your pension, you don't get to decide how the pension fund manages it.
Well, I think if it's I don't know the specific examples you're talking about. I know that certain insurance companies had issues, but this is in response. This is in regard to defined benefit pensions. So that means the recipient of the pension isn't affected. It might be the insurance company or the company providing the pension who's taking a financial hit.
And what that just carries down to their shareholders not doing as well.
Well, presumably there'll be loss of value to their shareholders. In that instance, if it's a defined benefit plan that is sponsored by and funded by a company, but there are fewer and fewer of those these days. So yes, if you're forced to sell an asset at an undervaluation because of a market market crash, or that is a permanent loss of value. I would agree with that. I don't know that the damage to the pound though was permanent, particularly if Jeremy Hunt can put the nation's fiscal policy stance on a sounder footing. And the other thing I would say is that one of the great things about democracies is that we have elections. So people and in the UK, I think there's an election in 2 years' time. So you've got the ability to change the government if they haven't been doing so well. Unfortunately, that's not a privilege that most countries in the world have.
Yeah. But whether there's anyone else who knows what they're doing to be able to vote in. And the damage to the pound, it's the volatility that was caused that then led people losing on foreign exchange positions they had or whatever. Which again, I think that's the problem with the financial system, that people don't seem to understand that it's like the people think the financial system is about only wealthy people participating, when it's actually all of us who will, in Australia and I guess in the UK it's compulsory to contribute to a pension fund, and that money is invested in the system, and so the people are working very hard to earn a return on that money so that we can not be impoverished in retirement.
Yep.
So then what happens to the people who are affected by this? How do they then respond to the government? Like, is there then a thing where people will be trying to have an impact on getting rid of Liz Truss or whatever? Like the shareholders who have lost out, how do they then respond? Because it's caused by the government's actions.
Well, they've got to...
Or is it just...
Well, they've got to vote, haven't they? If you look at the opinion polls, and I can't... I was reading the weekend edition of the FT, and I can't quote the numbers exactly, but I think the opinions polls show that the Labor Party are miles ahead in the current voting intentions of the British public, and the Conservative vote. The Conservative vote at this stage has collapsed. So I guess that's an outworking, and that's why as I understand it, there again, it's I'm just repeating what I've read over the weekend. There are doubts as to whether Liz Truss will actually survive as Prime Minister, and that would be. I mean, you've had a revolving door of Prime Ministers over the past since the Brexit vote. There's been a revolving door, and it would be, and she might have the shortest tenure of any of them.
But I guess anyone doing business, and that's kind of a broader point from the extreme of what you were pointing to, countries where there is no democracy, and countries where there's corruption, and so it's like it's very difficult to do business there. So then you move somewhere that's a friendlier regulation system. My hairdresser, for example, from Iran, and it was just impossible to, whenever he left 20 years ago, it just wasn't possible to run a business. So then you move somewhere friendlier, but then I guess you just always are dealing with the political cycle. And then that's why you have a vote, so you can vote for the people who are better representing your interests.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to be said for democracy. I think Churchill said he couldn't think of I don't have the quote. I can paraphrase it rather than quote it specifically. He couldn't think of a worse system than democracy, except every other system. So it's got its issues, but it's better than any other system of government.
Yeah. And I guess someone said to me the other day, capitalism, there are winners and losers, but communism, everyone's a loser. Except for the one person.
Or pretty well. Or that? The group, the elite group, the elite group around the top.
Okay, well, I wanted to talk more about the dishonesty point, but I think we can probably do that at another time because it's already been over an hour. But could I just finish by asking when, for example, 2 examples when you have intervened when something went wrong, which was your second principle. So maybe if you have one from young, like at school age, and then if you have like a business example.
Yeah. Well,
or maybe the first point in your life when you realise that that's important.
Yeah. Well, I can give. I can remember an example from a business example when I was from maybe 20 odd years ago, where we had were involved in advising a client on a particular transaction, and some of the people who worked for the business unit that was going to be, in this case, going to be merged, but they would effectively lose their, if they didn't lose, they might not have lost their job, but they would certainly lose their power because the merger partner was going to take over management. I remember there was a presentation to the board that they had input into, and they had deliberately put incorrect information in the presentation to suggest that the deal was to cast the transaction in an unfavourable light. And the fellow who led, the most senior fellow who led who was responsible for the transaction, was going to present that to the board, and he didn't know that the numbers had been doctored. Let's use that term. So when I thought,
what kind of numbers were they?
Financial projections.
Like revenue
financial,
projections.
I mean, I think they were valuation numbers. So when I found out about this, I called the guy and got him about 5 minutes before he was about to step in the boardroom and present that analysis. And he was very grateful. The slides had to be presented, but I think what he did say was that they're preliminary and these numbers are subject to change, so it's just work in progress. So he managed to avoid a trap, basically. So that was, now the people who they were not the people who had doctored the information, let's say, were not very happy that I did that. But it was but the guy who I informed was very, very happy, because otherwise he'd look like because ultimately the truth does out. So that's an example, I would say, of where a matter of doing them.
But wasn't that in your self-interest?
No, I don't. Well, maybe not necessarily. I mean, I might have been if the senior guy believed his people rather than me, that would have been the end of me as an advisor in that situation. But it was the right thing to do, and it worked out correctly, because the relevant fellow appreciated the honest advice. So that's one example. And then another example, and it would be that I think but this is maybe a number of years ago, and it's sort of topical at the moment in the Me Too environment. But in our firm, we did find that we did find out that someone had been subject to some form of harassment. And it was by someone who was committed by someone who was a reasonably senior employee, and who certainly on on professional capability had a future with us. But we did, when something was drawn to our attention, we did a quick investigation, and frankly, we just made the decision that this person had to go. There wasn't any. There were no two ways about it. So that's another example of doing the something that had a short-term cost, but which was a cost we were prepared to incur, because in the interests of doing the right thing, not correcting, but certainly addressing something that was wrong, and we believe that it's something that was contrary to our values and our culture, and we felt that it was far better that we send a message that we take our values and our culture seriously, and that no matter how good an employee was, if they did something that was wrong and materially wrong, that it wouldn't be tolerated. So they're the two examples I've got for you. All right.
Okay. One last thing on the you may implied that globalization is a good thing, and you said something like, unfortunately, those trends aren't going to continue. A lot of people don't agree with that, as you can see of how people have voted over the last few years. So how do you explain to those people why globalization
that's
is
probably
a good thing?
Probably the subject of a different podcast, I think, Delia. But it's all to do with the theory of comparative advantage. And we're about to find out and maybe why people are not happy with globalization. It's not because of that globalization is bad in and of itself, but because the benefits haven't been shared equally, and that's to do with taxation systems by and large. But it's a bigger topic. But globalization has been a powerful driver of improved prosperity around the world, and reversing it will, as we are doing at the moment, and for sound reasons, because if you can't. There are certain where you've got geopolitical conflicts where you can't have essential elements of your supply chain dependent upon someone with whom you're in strategic conflict. So there's going to be a lot of onshoring and a lot of manufacturing back into Western countries, and that's important for strategic purposes, but it will entail higher costs, and higher costs mean lowest, other things being equal, a lower standard of living. So there we are. But that can be the subject of another podcast, if you like, Delia. All right.
Okay. Do you have anything else to add?
Thanks for the. No. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have round 2, and I look forward to round 3 if there's sufficient listener demand.